Good evening. More details emerged today of just who took part in the riots in the West Midlands. It came on the day two separate meetings were held to discuss the way the police handled the disturbances.
We've two reports tonight. In a moment, we'll be hearing from Midlands MPs who've criticised the tactics used by senior officers. We'll be getting reaction to that from the force's chief constable, who joins us live.
But first, Keith Wilkinson reveals who the rioters were and how the trouble here could cost £12 million.
As the rioters and looters rampaged, there was, in the words of the chief constable, a strong sense of loss and shock. Chris Sims says his force faced a series of simultaneous and linked tactical challenges. As violence escalated, with 11 shots being fired at the police from at least 4 firearms, there was a contingency plan which authorised the possible use of baton rounds. Today the chief gave his personal account of what it felt like to face such a crisis.
This came at us from very much a clear sky, that we felt ourselves, I think, on the Wednesday morning after 2 really difficult nights with the terrible murders, the shooting at officers. It felt a very, very dark place indeed for a while. I think I reflected, and I know colleagues reflected, a real sense that for all of our best efforts, we hadn't been able to protect communities in the way that we would want to. And then I think there began some rays of light. Tariq Jihad's comments, the sort of feedback from the public, a growing sense of order and calm across the West Midlands.
The chief constable presented a mass of statistics to his police authority. Some gave us some more detail about just who were the rioters. The police say of the 622 people arrested, almost all of them were male, aged from 12 to 59. 30% were 17 or younger. 16% were at school or studying. 3/4 had a previous conviction. More than half unemployed. 40% are described by the police as white European, 40% Afro-Caribbean, 17% Asian. As for the cost to the force, could be £10 to £12 million at a time of huge cuts to police budgets and staff. Keith Wilkinson, Central Tonight.
Well, at the same time as the police authority was discussing the rioting, West Midlands MPs were giving their verdicts on police tactics at a special meeting. They say people in parts of Birmingham say they felt ignored by police because efforts were being focused on the city centre.
Today, a committee of MPs investigating the violence was told that people in places like Handsworth and Lozells felt forced to protect their own properties because police weren't responding to their calls. Becky Johnson reports.
As fires raged in Handsworth, people feared for their homes and businesses, but their MP says the police didn't help.
The real serious issue was that people were saying that the police are just standing by and our shops and properties are being looted. And nobody's taking any notice. We're calling the police, we're asking them to do something, and nothing is happening.
Can we start moving, please?
Riot police were tackling violence in the city centre. Today, MPs heard people elsewhere felt forgotten.
The argument that the traders were putting up right on the spur of the moment when it was kicking off is, why is the police protecting that asset but ignoring us? Do we not count as citizens?
The consequence, the Home Affairs Select Committee was told, was people taking the law into their own hands.
You got people ready to defend their properties against these people. That could have broken out into a huge riot in itself and huge damage to people.
Haroon Jahan and brothers Shazad Ali and Abdul Musavir were murdered in a hit and run as they tried to protect businesses in Winson Green. Afterwards, it was Haroon's grieving father, Tariq Jahan, who calmed the tension, not the police.
The best thing you can do is go home.
MPs were told disappointment with the police response was raised at a community meeting.
The follow-up meeting from that is tomorrow, and again the idea is to try and facilitate this dialogue to get the relationship between the police and the community in Winson Green back to where it should be.
Today's evidence forms part of an inquiry into how the police response to the riots could could have been better, so that lessons can be learned for the future. Becky Johnson in Westminster for Central Tonight.
Well, joining us now is the Chief Constable of West Midlands Police, Chris Sims. Chris, thank you very much for joining us. Let's start first with the criticism that police ignored calls from people during the riots in areas like Handsworth, Lascelles and also Yardley that was mentioned. What's your reaction to that?
Well, we certainly didn't ignore calls, and the idea that we were attempting to police one part of the West Midlands and not police others is absolutely not true. I mean, I'd be very interested. I have attempted to speak to Khalid Mahmood and be very interested to pick up that discussion with him. But, you know, it was a really difficult, challenging night. We were arresting 116 people during that evening. The idea that we were standing back doing nothing, I do think we have nailed that myth once and for all. But it was a very challenging night. We were very stretched, and we move on from that.
You said, we heard from you there saying that after the first 2 days it felt like a very dark time.
Yes.
How does that feel for someone like you who is so responsible directly for public safety?
Well, this was an unprecedented challenge, and I think particularly the murders on the Dudley Road and the shootings at police officers could have taken us in a very different direction. And the appeal by the father, the wider work of the community, I think some good policing interventions as well, prevented this becoming disorder between communities, and with good grace, West Midlands has moved on.
Now, what about the budget cuts? How are you going to ensure that you can protect the public, given the budget cuts you're facing this year?
Yes, well, I reported to the police authority today that my view is that the budget cuts that we've made so far made no difference to the response that we were able to put to the incidents in August. I did also say that, of course, if we were facing a prolonged incident, then that might be much more challenging, and that we probably do have to accept that all police forces will need to rely more on each other. And bear in mind that there were 10 other forces supporting us during these troubles. I think we will have to rely more on each other than we've done in the past.
OK, well, let's move on to some questions we've heard from viewers. Craig Morris from Albury asked, if the riots happen again, what would the police do differently?
Well, I think there's 2 or 3 very early points of learning. I think in terms of our tactics, I think we would want to be more flexible, more mobile. I think that was a learning point. Certainly in terms of the specifics of this incident, to move quickly to arresting suspects was the issue, I think, that turned the balance. I think we would want to try to think about how we interpreted all of that social media chatter. Really difficult because there's a lot of untruths and nonsense on it, but we do need to think about how we interpret that. And there's lots of other things that we would learn from as well.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Chief Constable Chris Sims, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming in. Now, the poor state of many